Well, and fans are going to hate me for asking this question, but the reality is too, there were really three big anomalies in 2024 that if you were to even say, hey, if this just happened at half the rate that it did, you're
Hmm.
probably a playoff team. And I would say that that would be injuries, which
Hmm.
a lot of the league experienced. So that's not an excuse, but it is
No.
still something that happened at an incredibly high rate.
The only
Um,
thing I would say with that, I mean, look, yeah, I get you. The problem there is that the number one team in games lost to injuries this past year
was the Dodgers.
won the World Series.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. The other factor was underperformers, and especially underperformers like all in bunches at just the wrong time, right? Like
Right.
Nico, you look at his numbers at the end of the season, and you're like, oh, he had a pretty similar year over
Right.
year, but really he made up so much ground in September when games
Yeah.
really just at that point didn't mean anything.
Hmm.
Belly,
Hmm.
Swanson for most of the season until the end. And then when you're missing guys like Bellinger and Seiya, your two big
Hmm.
bats for a big part of the time. So those factors. And then I one thing I want to talk about is Wrigley Field. Like
Yeah.
being there that year and seeing the way that it played, was that just weird?
It was weird, and like people don't want to hear it, right? But it's just weather's weird, baseball's random. You just kind of got to hang with them. And I don't. To me, there's nothing to be done with that
You can't.
information. It's
Yeah.
just the way it played. But look, the one component of Wrigley Field that I think gets blown out of proportion is the idea of the wind blowing out. Even at peak Wrigley, it doesn't happen very often. That's not like a thing that happens very frequently. And then this year, it just didn't happen. I mean, the Cubs played the Yankees in a 3-game series and no
No
homers
home
were
runs.
hit.
Yeah.
It was bizarre. So, I, again, I think that if you're not going to get down with like the nerdy type stuff, I'm sure you're going to kind of roll your eyes at that. But it impacted their team for sure. I mean, statistically, they were a terrible offensive team at home. They pitched really well at home. I I don't know what to say. I think it was quirky and odd, but I would still. I think you have to go back into this year and assume that the place will play the way it normally plays, which is still erratic, by the way.
Yeah.
But last year it was so pitcher friendly.
So sticking on this topic just for a second, because you talk to the players a decent amount. What is it as fans, we say, okay, wind is blowing in, that should affect balls that are hit, near the warning track.
Right.
It shouldn't impact, if Dansby Swanson hits a double down the line. It shouldn't impact if a little, line drive over the second baseman's head with a runner in scoring position happens. But
Hmm.
for some reason, it did. Is that mental, or is there something that we don't feel as fans with these players on the field? Like, what were the players telling you of how it was impacting those kinds of offensive numbers?
They don't like to engage in, like opening up the hatch and saying,
Okay.
come on in, let's talk about like how I feel about this. I had conversations with guys. What I would say is you stick with your approach. The issue becomes when you're hitting a ball 110 uh, with a 28-degree launch angle and it doesn't leave the park and it's supposed to leave the park 96% of the time, that starts to get in your head. This
Yeah.
is a sport where one of the things they always preach is process, process, process. So, like, if you stick with good process, eventually the results will even out. And that's a myth, by the way, that it won't necessarily even out, that even 162 may not always be enough of a sample size for that stuff to even out. What I would tell you more than anything, though, is this: that in today's game, um, the way you score is by slugging. So
Yeah.
whether it's runners in scoring position slugging or just slugging, that's how you score. And that's what the conditions affect so much. It's slug. So it's not it's not the 80s and the 90s, or 80s and 70s and early 90s, whatever. But it's where you're taking two and going to right or something. It's different. So it's about slug, and the conditions affect slug.